Yay. So, welcome to What a Word is Worth, a space for creative minds to speak about viable ways to heal the world through writing and other inventive mediums. This is your host, Marianela Medrano. I am the founder of Palabra Training Center, where words are given as medicine. Palabra Training Center is dedicated to creating a more compassionate and just world by training those who are invested and committed to making change possible. We offer writing workshops, mental wellness retreats, and other ways that teach emotional and psychological flexibility through mindfulness. We welcome people from all walks of life, financial means, and physical challenges to join us. If you would like to learn more or feel inspired to support us, please visit palabracenter.org. Today, my guest is Dr. Carly Hudson. She is the founder of the Healing Ground and is a chiropractor, a care center in Denver, Colorado. Dr. Carly believes that bringing more movement into your day is just one way to improve your health and well-being. As an infant, Dr. Carly suffered a devastating and life-threatening illness. She was left with invisible handicaps, including a balance disorder or balance disorders, muscle spasticity, and hearing loss. She had to begin again to learn how her body worked, and so began her path of lifelong learning and healing. With the gift of this injury, Dr. Carly has spent her life exploring how deliberate self-care impacts our mind, body, and spirit. Dr. Carly attended University of the Western States and is now a successful chiropractor who has been in practice for 6 years or maybe more by now, with additional certifications in massage, yoga, and exercise therapy. She helps hundreds of patients recover from injuries, illness, and chronic pain. You can hear more about her work in her podcast, Healing Ground Movement. So welcome, Dr. Carly.
Oh, thank you, Marianela. I'm so excited to be here and get to chat with you today.
Yes, this is, I love talking to you. So this is like the perfect excuse.
I
You
really
have
agree.
you have actually helped me in ways you can't imagine, just with your good listening skills and your extraordinary sense of humor. And those are qualities that heal the aching body and heart of patients and friends equally. And I read in your upcoming book how you relied on school grades, intelligence, and structure to survive before discovering the wisdom of the body through yoga. You also said you found your people when you joined debate, speech, and theater in your sophomore year in high school. Poetry was a way of subsistence for you then. My question is, what is your relationship with writing these days? Is writing part of the deliberate self-care that impacts our mind, body, and spirit? And is it connected to soma, to the body?
Yes. Oh, I love that. And you've made me blush so much already. Thank you. Um, so it started for me that writing became the way to describe something that I didn't really understand yet. my injuries. I had traumatic brain injury from bacterial meningitis, and they were amorphous in a way. You couldn't see them. And I looked and acted in the world good enough. I compensated well, but there was a lot about my experience with the world that didn't fit. And then when I found the misfits, that made life a little bit easier too. But writing with poetry and having this license where the language of expression didn't have to fit into, a prose, a semantic following. It could stop, it could fall off mid-sentence and cause confusion within a stanza, really illuminated and reflected the way I often felt inside as I was trying to give name to all these syndromes that I didn't understand until I was nearly 30 years old. And so, in that way, poetry was the best way I could understand myself and the best way I could offer myself to my community in seeking understanding.
Mhm.
So now, writing has continued to be an outlet in a way, a finding my way through new symptoms or new healing patterns, new healing crises, I call it, because healing is not
I
always
love that. Healing crisis.
well, it puts a spin on it, right? That healing is not a straight line, and sometimes healing or moving yourself forward to a new plateau of health is like really uncomfortable and terrible, if we're being perfectly honest. Doing the work is not easy, and poetry is a place to put that work
Mm.
outside of yourself, and share it as a story to those around you and those that love you. And then, and writing my book, my memoir with some cultural commentary in it, it was the revisiting of that and looking back and reflection of, is the way that I saw myself in the past, the way I see myself going forward. All of this through the expression of writing and placing these deep emotions on the page outside of our
Mm.
physical body. It's freeing.
Yeah, yeah. And I had a peek into that wonderful book you're writing, and I can see yeah, what you're saying in this concept of a healing crisis. And this podcast is focused on the value of words and their impact. So the way I see it is that words are compacted into salutogenic balm that can heal the world.
Salutogenic balm. Oh, I love that.
Yes,
Speaking of
like which is
words,
like, yeah,
yes.
we can heal the world one word at a time if we know how to hear the words actually.
Mhm.
So I also believe that the body speaks volumes and that it has a wisdom that expands to the farther reaches of the imagination. Like the body, as Van der Kolk wrote, the body keeps the score. So we know that the body is the depository of memories. So is always speaking volumes. Um, how how in your practice, Eduardo Galeano, the writer journalist from Uruguay, he's no longer breathing, but his work is, and he wrote something that goes like this: the church says the body is a sin. Science says the body is a machine.
Mhm.
Advertising says the body is a business. The body says, I am a fiesta. So, can you pinpoint how your body language meets your emotional language? Because that's what I felt in your book.
Mm.
So can you talk about when you are writing, the sense I have is that you're reading your body as you're
Mhm.
writing. There is so much wisdom distilled from the somatic expressions in your book. Can you say more about that?
Absolutely.
I know that I went all over, but
I love it. And that quote,
Mhm.
I'm going to have you tell me that again when I can write the whole thing down. I love it because he encapsulates so wonderfully what I've been trying to say from a very didactic clinical point of view to my patients for a long time. And to put it so beautifully as the body is a fiesta. But this idea that we are separate, that our body and our somatic experiencing of injury and pain is somehow separate from our emotional or mental experiencing, which is different than our spiritual and passionate experiencing. And what I love he puts in is the commodity piece from the cultural aspect of the body. You know, culturally, we do see the body as a commodity, and we see it as something that should be degraded so that we can profit on it. You know, any industry does. And so to pull at all of these threads and to call yourself a fiesta, to call yourself this full experience of emotion, because of course within that fiesta, within that party, there are the highs, there are the lows, there are the dark corners of the party, there's the center stage. We are all of those things encapsulated into one. It is an act of rebellion in and of itself. And I want us to embody ourselves, all of us, as a rebellion against how we have been put through the schism over years. So to get to your question more directly, when I go back on these memories, you know, throughout the book, there are a lot of what I started writing was in vignettes, and I started stringing these vignettes together. And to go to those places in my childhood and my adolescence, I sunk into my body and my body's experience. And I started with the feeling of being present in that. And my body told me the story, brought those memories back. There's one vignette I wrote of my grandfather that has, you know, I've carried with me for so many years. He passed away when I was a young child. He just meant the world to me. And it was when he was taking handful of prescribed pills for the litany of things that a 70-something-year-old man in the 90s might have been prescribed for. And to start that, it started with the feeling of the warm sun of Colorado in the winter, because we are sunny and bright all year round. And it opened up the scene in front of us. The body remembers these things and can take us there. To the point too, as you brought up Vanderkolk and the body keeps the score, we hold the traumas and the happiness, we hold the dark and light pieces of that fiesta, of that party within ourselves, that pain is instilled within us, that we hold it in those places of injury. And by writing our way through it, we release a bit more. So other vignettes that I wrote about are things that, quite frankly, I've been in therapy about for half my life working through. And I have found a lot of forgiveness, and I have found a lot of cognitive processing and talking it through, or receiving massage. But writing out that story was, in a sense, an exhale of smoke out of my body to finally set the story aside. And you see it differently.
The naming, right? Like there is such power in naming. Once that is done, then there is that separation, that necessary separation from the event. Is that part of what you're saying?
And I think when I started off as a creative writing major, actually way back in the wind.
That's very clear in your book. It comes through. It's such a fluid writing you do.
Thank you. And one of my teachers told me that we could get caught up in the pursuit of perfectionism in our writing. And at some point, when you have devoted the words to the page or to the screen as it is now, you have to cut the tie. You have to birth the word and release it into the world so it becomes the world's story. And I think that's the power of writing it out. You know, we can have, actually, you and I were just talking about this before you hit record. We can have the stories that are too soon to give to the world.
Right.
But when you reach that place of completion, that place where vulnerability can become a gift,
Mhm.
turning those feelings, the somatic experiences into story becomes a gift that other people can learn from and identify with and carry with them. And in a way, you get to set it down as well.
Yeah. And with the passing of time is when we can go from the cognitive into the embodiment,
Hmm.
right? Like it's
Yeah.
not easy to distinguish that when you're doing things right in the heat of the moment, so to say.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but I think if we are gentle enough to witness ourselves without
Hmm.
judgment,
Hmm.
you know,
Yes. Yes.
I recently had a re-injury of a TBI, that as we were talking about traumatic brain
Hmm.
injury.
Hmm.
And as I witness myself, I still feel very angry about the source of this injury. I still
Hmm.
feel
Hmm.
very emotional about the 5 months I
Hmm.
have spent recovering.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I don't need to judge that. And I
Right.
also don't need to write it yet either, because I
Hmm.
am still feeling it. There is no
Yeah.
story yet. It is
Yeah.
being lived.
Yes, exactly. That's beautiful.
Mhm.
That it has that process has to happen, that witnessing. You
Mhm.
know, in therapy, I talk about inviting people to practice gauging, kind of noticing the thoughts,
Mhm.
noticing the feelings, noticing the images.
Mhm.
And that is what lead people to eventually get to a point of self-modulating, right? So it's a process. It is a process. So
Mhm.
I think as writers, when the pandemic first said, there were so many people writing about the pandemic, and I couldn't
Mhm.
make sense of it. I was like, I can't. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like I'm still processing. My
Mhm.
body is still processing, so my mind cannot articulate anything. So I think that what is the word? Brewing. The
Mhm.
brewing
Yeah.
process is so important.
Well, and I think there's a half truth that can be born of
Mhm.
articulating it, and I'll say publicly, because we all have our journals. We all should have our journals and our personal writings where we process it in pieces. But if we've ever gone back to look at those journals, particularly the angsty teenage years, they are
Mhm.
half truths.
Mhm.
They are the snapshot of the moment that we see in front
Mhm.
of us. And I
Mhm.
did a lot of poetry writing at the onset of the pandemic, and some of the poems I came back to a year and a half later, and
Mhm.
I flushed them out, but they needed
Mhm.
more flesh on their bones. They were a skeleton of
Absolutely.
our experience,
Mhm.
um, because it was just that flashbulb of that moment. And that's
Mhm.
powerful in and of itself. But I think in this healing process, we can mistake the flashbulb for the full story.
Yes, and that's the importance of journaling,
Mhm.
putting it aside, and then let evolution take its course and
Mhm.
then go back. And I think that's why your book flows so well, because you've been working with these in an evolutionary way.
Mhm.
That it's being metabolized.
Yeah, I knew that I wanted to write this book. I knew that I wanted to teach something of my story, since I was very, very young, since I was in my 20s. And because it's unique, I had a 5% chance of survival from my illness. I write alongside my father's battle and recovery with opiates. It was a thick childhood to wade through. And there's a lot to share from that. But as I came out of my 20s and, left the home, and so left that childhood, it was still all too clear that I didn't actually have anything to say about it. I had a lot to say of it, but
Mhm.
the lessons hadn't been earned yet. And it took
Yeah.
another, 15 years.
Yeah, and I want to segue here into it's related, but as someone who has overcome different health challenges and was saved by a pathogenic focus on medicine,
Mhm.
meaning a doctor set out to find the pathology that was attacking
Mhm.
your body. And when he found the meningitis, he treated it, saving your life, but not the subsequent neuropsychological and physiological and psychological problems that stem out of it. How did you go? Can you say more? How did you go from being an ailing person to becoming the wonderful healer you are? Because you are one. You're a true healer.
You're making me cry. I think I got to see a lot of perspectives on health. I got to see the magic of modern medicine as it goes after a pathogenic source and pumps you full of antibiotics and steroids. Still, nothing's going to get past that. But I also got to see the failings of that system, where my dad started at 13 or 14 years old being given opiates for migraines. And that was the solution, until by the time I was born, and even as I was fighting for my life in the hospital, my dad was taking levels of painkillers that quite frankly should have killed him. It's amazing that it didn't. I'm terrible at quoting numbers, so I won't at this moment, but the general theme should suffice. So my childhood was, it held both, it held the shadow side and the light of what we call our healthcare system in a very stark contrast. And we don't beat around the bush in my family. My parents told me what my dad struggled with when I was in third grade. We know from the get-go. And so I didn't have any heroic illusions about what the MD after your name meant. And over time, I've come to learn, as I was told by physician after physician, that I was good enough, that my compensating well and quality of life was just going to be what it was going to be. I saw how medical practice as we see it now kind of leans a little bit more to that machinery. Leans to treating us like a machine that needs to be taken apart, rub a little oil on some joints, replace them if need be, put you back together, and away you go. It doesn't focus on the quality of life. The quality of life is that unknowable force, that spark that we can only decide for ourselves what is really good enough. An MD wasn't going to be able to tell me. And so everything that came next in my life that made it worth living came from healers, came from the people who wanted to know how I was and if how I felt was good enough for me. If my profound hearing loss, if the fact that my movement disorders were so severe, I couldn't participate in any sports or movement activities in my entire life. I couldn't stand on one foot until I was 27 years old without falling over. That when we start to get down to the root of our dysfunctions, all of these pathways intersect, and we can't call ourselves a machine anymore. We have to see how my suicidal depression overlapped with chronic neurological dysfunction that made me feel so othered in my world that I couldn't cope and keep up anymore. And the one started to feed into the healing of the other, which fed into the need for another provider that led into another place of healing, where now whenever I'm on a podcast being asked more specifically about health, and I'm being asked like, what's the one thing and what do we need to do? It feels like a disingenuous question, because there is no one thing. We have to start approaching health from the position of the anti-silver bullet. And in that way, we start to see the way all these systems come together, and we can tweak and move little pieces at a time. And it is so individual to the person and what they are going through and what their body needs, what their mind needs, what their spirit needs, what their community is giving them, that there's no prescriptive protocol under the sun. And I think because I spent so much of my life trying to be seen for what I couldn't find words to express, that's the gift that I want to give my patients, is to look with them at what they've brought into the office and and really see what they're asking for, not what their symptoms are demanding.
Yeah. So, where this is sending me back is to the principle of reciprocity and interdependence that is so at the heart of indigenous cultures, and that has saved the indigenous cultures. They have allowed them to survive, colonialism and all the isms that had attacked them. So what I hear you say is that when you have a person in front of you, you learn, some people model for you this interdependent reality, right? That nothing stands, on its own.
Mhm.
Everything is interrelated. So part of your process, part of the journey of becoming this healer you are, was because you were touched. I'm thinking about Dr. Z that you talk in the book, and how much listening he
Mhm.
did, right? And other people, you talk about the connections that you made, so that healing was not just popping pills, but it was actually when you started doing the work in the body. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that we have mistaken symptom management for healing.
Yes.
And we can, and there's a place for it. Again, it's
Mhm,
my life.
mhm,
And I think that some of us find ourselves in a position where the symptoms of our chronic whatever itis, osis, or what have you is too much to manage without a symptom, without something to help with the symptoms. There's a place for
mhm,
that.
mhm,
We can't stop there and call it healing.
mhm, mhm,
And when we are with a healer, a provider, a helper, there is something that I've noticed, that is of my opinion, and in my poetic mind, I think I'll give
mhm,
myself away.
mhm,
The healing doesn't start when the patient starts doing the exercise, the rehab, the diet change, the
mhm.
mental acrobats that come with therapy. It comes from the first time they are heard and witnessed.
So beautiful. Yes.
And that's what happened to me,
Mhm,
that for all the time I spent in Dr. Z's office, which was a
mhm,
lot, and all the
mhm,
time I've spent doing this care for the next 7, 8 years, it was the
mhm,
moment that he looked at me and said, I believe you, I know what's happening, and I can help you.
mhm, mhm,
That the armor of the burden that I'd been carrying around with me my whole life, that I never even thought to call it a burden because I had no other option, it became named and it cracked open, and that was the potential moment. And I think
that he
that's
said you're not broken, right? So
yeah,
that, yeah, that
yeah.
permission.
That this is something we can mold, that this
Mhm,
is, as you put, there's more like clay.
mhm,
And I
mhm,
think there's this moment that we can come to, but it's quiet, it's subtle, as a
mhm,
patient,
mhm,
that it's a choice point. If you're heard and you're seen and you're told, this is something we can work with,
mhm.
do you choose to dive deeper into that crack that has been opened for you and begin to do the work? Or do you see that crack as part of the injury and start slathering it with band-aids and medications? And where do you want to go when that opens for you? That to me is the beginning of healing, and everything else that comes after it is a tributary of that choice.
Yeah, yeah. But the opening is with that human touch, that inter dependence, that
Mhm.
interbeing. Thich Nhat Hanh used to refer to the term of interbeing.
Mhm.
Everything is interrelated. So when you are seeing, and this is something that you touch at various points in your book, that idea of being seen, being
Mhm.
heard, and then you kind of stand tall and proud, and you know what to do. So
Yeah.
you discover your own medicine, right?
Yeah. But
That is within.
yeah, but you highlight a really important point, that doesn't happen solo. That happens
Mhm,
within
mhm.
community.
Yes.
It happens within being held for all that you are and all that you could possibly be. not being told that you are not enough or this is where you will stay. I think
Right.
we all hope to be more. We all hope
Mhm.
to be the better and better version of ourselves in
Mhm.
whatever way we want
Mhm.
to express it.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
is the breath of life that comes from community, and that is healing too.
Yes, exactly. And that sense of welcoming people when they come to us. And it begins like it's in everything. It's in how you prepare your space, how welcoming your space is.
Mhm.
It's in how much you are getting to know yourself so
Mhm.
that you can sustain the other person, right? Like when you know how to stand on your own as a
Mhm.
healer, then the person who comes to you feels sustained by that.
Yeah, it's a give and take. It's a lesson that my dad taught me, and he doesn't ever
Mhm.
remember saying this, but I swear it's the best parenting advice I ever got long before I had a daughter of my own. And he says
Mm.
that parenting is essentially knowing, pardon my French, knowing where your shit ends and
Yes.
theirs begins, and not to confuse it.
Mhm.
Because as we come up against people or with people in our world, and very intimately within our family
Mhm.
units, but also healing relationships are their own kind of intimacy. It can
Mhm.
become very tempting to confuse that line when the stories start
Mhm.
to feel similar. And, as I talk about my recent brain injury, um, I watched myself play more loosely with that line because I found that I was seeking that same validation that my patients were seeking. I didn't know my container yet. And I didn't know where mine ended and theirs began.
Mhm. Mhm.
But if we can know our container, know what our shit is, then we can also know where the empathy lands with the person with whom we're talking with the person with whom we're in relationship. So they say, I see you, I hear you, here is a story that is similar to yours, going back to the
Mhm.
writing, the poetry. Here is a story that I know you will identify with, but I also know it is not your story. Tell me your story. And we have communal healing.
Exactly. That is beautiful.
Mhm.
Um, we, since the beginning of times, for as far as we can look back, trauma has been part of us, of human reality. But right now, we're going through the collective trauma of COVID-19.
Mhm.
And what it has done. I think you and I spoke a little bit in when you invited me to your podcast. We spoke about how the potent light that is on issues of equity and health disparity that is coming up, with COVID-19. So how much trauma are you seeing in your treatment of bodies as people face so many dislocating factors at once? Um, and going back, like, how do you connect
Mhm.
from a place of knowing where you end and where they begin? Um, and then, so it's a two-part question. How say more? I mean, you already said a little bit about this, but say more about that meeting halfway with the people who come to you, and to show the I see you, I hear you.
Mhm.
And then the second part of that question is, what are you prescribing these days the most?
So it's been a handful of months.
Mhm.
I I started really feeling for, and this is no disrespect for the frontline workers that we know are making life and death decisions on behalf of their patients, and
Mhm.
and the emotional stress of that. But in my own empathy, in my own storytelling, I started turning towards the therapists and the manual therapists and the teachers that have to hold that conversation, the conversation of trauma. And it
Mhm.
is, oh, it was heavy. Oh, there were some
It's
rough
everywhere,
sleeps,
right? It's
everywhere,
everywhere.
everywhere. And most of the time, I saw this shift in the length of my patient visits was sort of
Mhm,
the best
mhm,
data I can give
mhm,
around it is I would
mhm,
have patients that would typically come in. My visits are usually about a half hour long. That leaves
mhm,
room for, if you new injury, tell
mhm,
me what's going on in your life. But
mhm.
sometimes I would have really efficient people who just want to come in, get adjusted, review on their exercises, and away they go. They didn't need me for their conversational community at that moment. But particularly in the face of the lockdowns and me being one of the few essential places open in my area, well, I mean, there are lots of chiropractors, but one of the types of services, I became the place where my patients could enter into community. And my visit suddenly went to the full half hour and a breath over.
Mhm.
And the adjustment still took 5 to 10 minutes, but the conversation about the stress and the pain they were going through in their life, the worry, the fear, depending on what news channel they were watching, the fear was
Mm.
different, but the words were different, but the fear was the same. And I had patients suddenly have such chronic disease, chronic dysfunction
Mm.
in their body that I was now seeing them weekly or every other week where I hadn't seen them for, a month and a half to 2 months at a time. I got to see very palpably, pun intended, very palpably how stress and emotional angst shows up in the body, just one thing after another breaking down. We'd get the rib dysfunction under control, and suddenly it's plantar fasciitis. We get the plantar fasciitis going, and now the hip is hurting. And I could not get people off my table. And lo and behold, as the narrative started to change and hope started to creep in, and we could at least go back to our lives in some semblance of normalcy, be within community at whatever size felt comfortable to the individual, their pains went away and I stopped seeing them as much. And it went back to this more normalized place. So we hold these emotions, we hold trauma in the body.
Absolutely.
And maybe it shows up physically in the body. Maybe we displace it into a mental dysfunction or a chronic pain. And right now, the leading cause of death for 18 to 40-year-olds is a fentanyl overdose.
Mhm,
We
mhm,
see this trauma come through, and what I prescribed was honestly, unfortunately, not often listened to,
mhm,
because and to me, I would try to explain it the best I could and as diplomatically as I could without showing the hand on what my fears and biases around this whole situation were, because that's mine, that's my container. They didn't need another person to argue with or bemoan with, depending on who they were. Um, but it was to stop watching the fear, to turn off whatever channel you were watching, because the media, the television shows, all of it is, if it bleeds, it leads. It is entertainment, infotainment at this point.
mhm,
There
mhm,
are reliable
mhm,
places to just go get the dry facts, but
mhm.
your news channel is not that.
Yeah.
And we can consume too much, and we can have that emotional trauma show up in our body, but we don't associate the two, because going back to that beautiful quote of who owns what place of our person, we have to marry them again. And so that, as I was writing my book over the course of the pandemic, became a very large part of the lesson I wanted to teach, is that if we truly want health, we have to understand that it is a three-legged stool of body, mind, spirit. And if you knock one leg out, you're always going to be off balance. And that is what I saw over the last 2 years. And I kept trying to hand people a leg of their stool and tell them it mattered to the other two.
Mhm, mhm. That
I don't know.
interconnection.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking, what was bringing people to you at a, in more frequent and lengthy visits was the wisdom of the body that wanted to be healed, that wanted to be touched,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the thing that the pandemic kind of unraveled for us was that fear of perishing, that fear of dying, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what better place to go than someone who can maneuver your body and remind you that you are alive and that you are vital.
I,
So
and for a lot of my patients, there was no one else to touch them.
mhm,
They might have a partner at home, and so there's one other
mhm,
person, but for many, there was no one else to touch them. And so I noticed, and it broke my heart, to be perfectly honest and perfectly
mhm,
frank, that as I had them lay down on my table, and I'm a routine person. I have them lay down face down every time, and I start with placing my hands on their upper back and slowly walk their hands down their back. And the first placement of my hands, their body would stiffen to a foreign contact. I mean, people I've been treating for years, but to a foreign contact and to someone touching them during a pandemic in which proximity is dangerous.
yes, yes.
And then the softening and almost the urgency to feel more. And so I started making small back massages part of my care every single
Mhm,
time before we got
yeah.
down to the business of adjusting. Here is safe touch,
Mhm,
because it's not safe to shake hands, give high five, even get within energetic heart distance of someone. You've decided I'm safe. Here is some safe touch, because returning safe touch to our body is part of how we understand our container and stop having these light bulbs of pain go off saying, show me where my container is, show me where it is safe.
and that's gonna be, I mean, in terms of us learning and um, healing from this crisis,
Mhm.
is what we're gonna know about touch, what we're gonna affirm actually, because we know a lot about somatics and
Mhm.
what it means, right? To listen to the body and to create the safe spaces for the body to be both inner and outer spaces. But I think one of the things that's going to unravel or unfold from this pandemic is that conversation.
I hope so.
Yeah.
And I choose to be really hopeful, as
Hmm.
we talk about healing crisis at the
Hmm.
beginning of our conversation, that the body doesn't heal and the body doesn't change, the mind doesn't change, spirit doesn't change without a crisis to push it
Hmm.
forward, because
Hmm.
we are creatures of stagnation. And I think globally, there have been pockets of trauma throughout the globe throughout the years, and not to undermine that, but as a global
Hmm.
civilization, it has been several generations since crises has struck. And since we have had to take a look at how we have engaged with each other,
Yeah.
and healed forward. And so this crisis, this global crisis, has brought to light ourselves and our intimate neighborhoods, and then the neighborhoods of countries and communities around the world. What is everyone doing? What stock is everyone taking of what works and what doesn't work? Since World War II, um, the way we communicate with the world has exploded. It has gotten so much smaller. And I think the speed of that had jumbled our communication, our homeostasis, our
Mhm.
health as a global community.
Yeah.
And the health of our global community really, really suffered over the
Mhm.
last 2 years, not just at the hands of the virus, but at the hands of um,
Politics,
the
right?
politics and the
Hmm.
procedures that were put
Hmm.
in,
Hmm.
showed the issues with education, showed inequity in race, gender identity, sexual identity, small businesses versus big businesses,
Hmm.
small children in unsafe homes and families, and then, just access across the globe. We have to heal that, because we
Hmm.
can't turn our back on something that was that loudly dysfunctional for
Hmm.
so many years. And to me, that is a silver lining. It is a
Hmm.
healing crisis, and I really hope we
Yeah.
come through it.
I think Mother Earth has her way to get our attention, right? to really turn us to what matters. And, I work, as you know, I work a lot with the goddesses in the indigenous, both the African and Taino part of my my heritage. And we have quite a few goddesses of wrath, goddesses that, they find a way to break things down so that we can then become creative and rebuild, right? And I think that's what we're seeing, is that there is going to be a rebuild, there is going to be a renewal that is going to come from, but we have our work cut out for us.
Oh, goodness, don't we? And that is I think the conversation that we're coming to now as things, well, I guess it depends on where you are in the world, whether you think it's coming to a close or not. But here in Colorado, we're starting to have, they're predicting about 70 to 80% natural herd immunity. And so it sounds like we're on our way. So I'll make my little microcosm what I'm referring to. But as we start to get out of crisis mode, because we can't heal and we can't grow while we are in stress and panic and survival, at a very cellular level, our physiology does not allow it. Both survival and growth require a huge amount of energy pointed in two opposite directions, to grossly oversimplify. So we've been in survival mode for the last 2 years. Now we are having this cracking open, this possibility to talk about what healing is. We're having this moment of sitting down face to face with our community, kind of like we talked about, provider to patient. This is what's wrong, and this is how I think we can fix it together with your buy-in. Now, do we want to slap a Band-Aid over it and say, never mind, this didn't really happen, we'll just manage the symptoms? Or do we want to dive deeply and start rebuilding from a very foundational level? And my bias is absolutely that we do that. That's my hope.
And in a collaborative way, where it's this, two-way street, where it's not just you prescribing, but it's this conversation. Yeah. What are some other things? What final words do you want to share with the listeners, and how do they get to your podcast?
Oh, thank you. I'll have to think about the final words. So I'll do, I'll be administrative first. So my podcast is called Healing Ground Movement Podcast. And it's on any platform, Spotify, Apple, iTunes, all of that. I also have a website, healinggroundmovement.com, and that has a wonderful, my admin assistant did this, she did a beautiful job of creating an episode index. So we talk a lot about health and healing from this very holistic view, offering both types of treatment that you may not have commonly heard of, that are not often prescribed in the traditional disease management model, that are more functional in nature, but also conversations like Marianella herself, she's a phenomenal guest, talking about how we need to look holistically at all areas of our life if we're going to seriously consider health. You can also sign up for my newsletter on that website, and you will be kept informed about my upcoming book called Fortunately, Unfortunately. I am hoping to have that out to anyone who wants to read it this fall. But if your listeners are all in the writing world, we know that that's a hope and a dream, and please sign up for the newsletter so I can actually keep you informed. My words of wisdom, my final thoughts are how much I love conversations like this, that this to me is an opportunity for healing when we can have an exchange of ideas that are expansive. And when we can look at the patterns in the microcosm of a 7-month-old baby who had meningitis and had a small chance of surviving to rebuild her life, to a global pandemic where, I mean, chances of surviving at the beginning of that thing weren't sounding so great either. And we have this chance to rebuild. we all have cataclysmic events at the personal level, the family level, the social level, and now the global level. And healing looks the same no matter where you look. It's complicated, it's messy, and it's not straightforward. And it requires a wonderfully open and creative mind.
Mhm.
And that's that was my takeaway from our conversation today.
It's beautiful, beautiful. Yes, healing crisis, the opportunities that are in the crisis, and
Mhm.
this concept of negative capability that we're not going to go into it. But thank you so much, Carly, for joining us. And thank you for the listeners for listening to What a Word is Worth. You can access today's interview at Anchor, and it will also appear in YouTube. And if you are interested, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. And also, if you found our program beneficial, leave us a review. I am with you in love and compassion always. Thank you.